world water make the tide rise high. Come inland and make your house go by. Fools done upset the old man river. Made him carry slave ships and fed him dead niggas. Now his belly full and he about to flood something. So I'm throwing a rope that ain't tied to nothing. Tell your crew use the H2 and wise amounts. It's the new world water and every drop counts.
Alright, this is it. It's the last one. Boom. Got a repeat up in here. You know, it's only got so many cups to go around. Alright, so for today, this is it. We're going to be talking about climate change. And I know some of you had put this down as one of your top concerns about future threats to international security that we're going to be dealing with. And so I thought it would be fitting to end with a discussion here. And so 3 things I want to get established today. So first of all, establish climate change as an emerging threat to international security. You just kind of briefly talk about how we began thinking about climate change as an issue. Second, in light of the fact that climate change is an existential threat to so many states, it's seen as one of the biggest security challenges. The question emerges, why has it been so difficult to get a good cooperative mechanism to deal with the problem of climate change? Why has this been so hard to cooperate on? And then third, talk about how different ideas of governance, what good governance is, have been shaped by different ideas about equity and justice, and how these have played out in the climate agreements and negotiations in the past, and have been encapsulated to some extent in the Paris Agreement. So first off, one of the things I thought was interesting about climate change is the fact that the knowledge about climate change is in fact a lot older than even I thought it was. I knew about Charles Keeling's studies in the 1950s and 60s and so on, tracing the amount of the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere of Mauna Loa. But in fact, knowledge about climate change and the contribution of burning fossil fuels to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the greenhouse effect is actually a lot older than that. And there were studies done in the 19th century by a Swedish scientist in particular, this scientist called Svante Arrhenius, in which he studied the contribution of burning coal, which was one of the primary sources of energy in the 1890s, to atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. And also the accumulation of what he called carbonic acid, which is carbon dioxide dissolved in the oceans that can change the pH balance of the oceans. So this knowledge is actually a lot older than we might think, or that many people realize. And the description of the possible effects of climate change are already fairly well known by most people. Rising sea levels, drought, bleaching, corals, the death of the coral reef at the Grand Barrier Reef off of Australia, ecosystem loss, fragmentation, floods in some areas, strengthening hurricanes. It's just a pretty catastrophic list, and you could go on from that, right? Melting permafrost in the Arctic, loss of Arctic, wildlife like polar bears and so on. It's just a very, very long list. And so a question emerges, which is that if the knowledge is so old, and if the projected outcomes of climate change are so devastating, why has it taken over 100 years to get the international society to do something meaningful about climate change? And then, of course, we can ask whether the Paris Agreement is actually meaningful, since it certainly stops well short of what is needed to actually meet the goals that we've ostensibly set out. So why has it been so difficult? And a large part of the answer is in the fact that we generally talk about climate change as something that affects all of us, something that, we're all in this together. But the reality is that we're not all in climate change together. And, the way that the UNFCCC and the UN Convention on Environment and Development, or UNCED, was the Rio Convention in the 1990s, have spoken about climate change and environmental catastrophe, I think has sometimes been a little bit problematic, because by describing it as an issue that we all, quote unquote, all suffer from, it overlooks the fact that a lot of climate change is beset by inequities in terms of who feels the burden of climate change and who is responsible for contributing to climate change. So first off, when we think about who experiences the burden of climate change, who suffers from climate change, a lot of that is pretty obviously going to be socioeconomically inequitable. For starters, richer countries tend to be the ones that are more able to spend the resources on climate mitigation, things like constructing seawalls, strengthening coastlines against erosion or rising sea levels, or buttressing them against hurricanes and so on. When they do experience disasters, they're often more able to restore communities, to rebuild and so on. And since climate change negatively affects agricultural productivity, because climate change can displace people from their land, it is certainly something that affects people living in poverty a lot harder and a lot more systematically than people who have access to more resources. There are also some gendered elements of climate change. So for instance, in areas where you have rural people need to go out and gather water for the household and for agriculture and so on, those tasks are usually borne primarily by women. And so in rural areas where women fetch water, in cases where you have drought or polluted water supplies or regular water supplies or whatever that can be occasioned by climate change, usually women are the ones who have to travel longer distances, are out of the household longer, have more burdens placed on them because of this climate catastrophe. And so there are a variety of ways in which the burdens of climate change are not felt equally. Certainly low-lying countries, for instance, like the Maldives or small island developing states, which have large coastlines which are more susceptible to rising sea levels, are going to feel the burden a lot more acutely and a lot more quickly than places like the United States, that does have a significant coastline, but so much of its territory is inland. And it's a lot less vulnerable, not invulnerable, but a lot less vulnerable to rising sea levels than other countries. So that's one aspect of it. The fact that climate change is not borne equally by all people means that not all actors from the governmental level to the local level are going to have the same vulnerability and perhaps the same level of interest in dealing with climate change. Some people are more capable and certainly willing to push off the problem for a little bit longer because it just doesn't align with their interests. There's another aspect as well which deals with the problem of the responsibility for creating climate change. So we're going to take a look at this graph right here, which you can get online. All right, so this right here shows the world's top 10 emitters. You can get this online at the World Resources Institute. See the URL and the website right there. And if you scroll down to the world's greenhouse gas emissions, what you can see is it shows you each country that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So this right here is the top 10 of all countries, all emissions, and it shows you the United States and their emissions and so on. And if you click on any of these countries, so okay, it's still working, right? So if you go to the US, right, opens it up, you can see that a large proportion of the US emissions are in energy, and then a smaller percentage got agriculture, industry, and waste right there, all right? And then if you go back to, let's take one of the large emerging countries, so to speak, right? So we look at Brazil right here, which is another major emitter, but of course a very small emitter. So the proportion of their emissions which come from agriculture is a lot larger respective to energy than in the United States. You can take another country. Let me pick one of these small-ass countries right here. So let's see, Tunisia, all right, Paraguay, wherever, right? So go to Paraguay, for instance, right? And you can see, oh, look at that. So their agricultural emissions are a huge part of their overall emissions, a lot more than energy and waste and industry and so on. So what that shows us is that different countries have different reasons for contributing to climate change. So if you are the United States, for instance, and a lot of your climate change greenhouse gas emissions come from energy, right? That means that the things that are driving your contribution to the problem are things like transportation, heating your house, putting on the light, right? Like playing video games or whatever, right? And of course, some important things like cooking, right? It's not all luxury emissions, so to speak. But then if you take a country like Paraguay or Brazil, right, their emissions, a lot of that, so much more comes from agriculture, either producing domestically or producing food for the international market. Or you take somewhere like China, for instance, as well, right, which also has a larger percentage, respective to the United States, of agriculture, right? And so you have those countries that are major emitters, India as well, but they're doing different things with their greenhouse gas emissions than the United States. So it seems a little bit strange to say that the United States or Canada or the EU, where a lot of these emissions come from the production, consumption of goods that are out of reach of the average person in Paraguay or India or China, that all of those countries are equally responsible for contributing to climate change. And yet that tends to be the narrative that we use, right? We're all in this together. We all have to deal with the problem together, but it's not exactly accurate. So on one hand, we technically would all be better off if we could cooperate to deal with the problem, but we don't really know who is responsible or who is going to be more vulnerable. We don't really have a clear set of guidelines on what the time frame is or how to apportion emissions requirements. And we also have an initial problem, which, as Barnett points out, we don't really know what the tipping point of ecological catastrophe is. Now, we do know or we do have some good scientific information to tell us that when greenhouse gas emissions reach a certain concentration, we will or we will not be able to keep average temperature rise above or beyond a certain point. And so, for instance, the current consensus is that if we want to keep greenhouse gas emissions to below 2 degrees, an increase of 2 degrees Celsius, we need to stabilize emissions at 350 parts per million. However, what happens at a 2 degree increase or a 3.5 degree increase or whatever increase that we have, a 5 degree increase? We don't really know. And without that kind of clear information to give us specific guidelines on something like we're going to have an increase of hurricanes at this percentage or this amount with this kind of gale force winds or this category, or we'll have a drought in these areas, or a specific scenario on what sea level rise is going to look like. Because we don't have that clear of an information on where the tipping point is, it becomes a lot easier for states and for certain actors to act imprudently, because the clarity of the consequences are not very well specified, let's say. And the fact that we know that there is a potential catastrophe doesn't help us if we don't know where the land for the catastrophe is. And as Barnett points out, that's a large part of the reason why people have been able to boot the problem down the line, so to speak. The problem with climate change is that the effects of it are so slow and so drawn out, and not only that, they're also so ambiguous. The past few years we've seen a rash of hurricanes that have hit the United States, for instance. You had Hurricane Harvey, before that there was Hurricane Katrina, there was Hurricane Maria, and so on. And the problem is, none of those hurricanes could conclusively be proved to be the result of climate change. All of those hurricanes, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines and so on, right? All of these major climate catastrophes could have come even if we didn't have climate change. And so it's not been easy to pinpoint what the actual result of climate change is or what it's like to be. And so that is going to make cooperation pretty difficult, to be honest. So with all of that in mind, when we think about questions like, as Barnett asks, how do you choose emissions limits for individual countries? And he asked that on page 650. When we combine use things like unequal vulnerability, different rates of industrialization, different greenhouse gas makeup, and a lack of clarity about tipping points, what we end up with is a set of different ideas about how you assess responsibility. So one example is to think about who are the major emitters of greenhouse gases right now. And China, since 2006, I think, has been the number one emitter of greenhouse gases. The United States was number one for a while, and China, superseded them. And so it might make sense to say, well, if China is the number one emitter, then they should probably take some kind of responsibility for cutting greenhouse gases. We're certainly not going to get anywhere in solving the climate crisis if China doesn't do anything to deal with the problem. However, if we think about China as the number one emitter, which is certainly true, we have to pay attention to the fact that, again, China has 5 times the amount of people as the United States. So even though as a country it's an aggregate larger emitter, per capita its overall emissions are a lot smaller than the United States and many other countries, including Canada as well. The other point too is that a lot of Chinese emissions come from manufacturing, and not just for the Chinese consumer, but also manufacturing abroad. And there's a problem or an issue called exporting emissions, where you have countries like the United States and the EU, regions like the EU, Japan, South Korea, and so on, that are purchasing goods that are manufactured in China, and as a result contributing to overall greenhouse gas emissions. But because those goods are not manufactured domestically, right, we in the United States or people in Europe or wherever can consume goods and then essentially export the blame for those emissions to China. So in other words, if Chinese emissions are a result of producing goods that are exported abroad, what we've essentially done in the industrialized world is exported the responsibility for these emissions to China. So Chinese overall emissions are large, not just because the Chinese are bad, so to speak, but because we are demanding that China produce certain things for our own consumption. So this graph right here shows the absolute responsibility of overall emissions, and you can see down at the bottom, you can see total greenhouse gas emissions on the left, with China as the largest and the United States as the second largest. Then the graph in the middle shows compares population, and what you can see is that even though the United States population is a lot smaller, its overall greenhouse gas emissions are pretty comparable to that of China. The following map right here shows the export of emissions from China to other countries. In essence, what it shows are the global emissions of carbon dioxide resulting from the import and export of goods, and the arrows show the direction and magnitude of flow, and the numbers are the millions of tons of carbon. So in other words, China produces goods that are worth about 395 million tons of carbon dioxide and exports those goods to the United States. So we consume that, but China is responsible, so to speak, of producing the greenhouse gas emissions that contribute to our consumption. So it's a problem. So that makes thinking about responsibility at the absolute level or the aggregate level a little bit complicated for those reasons. So maybe a better way to think about responsibility for climate change emissions is to think about it instead as emissions per capita. I mean, Brazil is trying to feed a lot of people. India is also trying to feed about 5 times the amount of people as the United States. So is China. And if you think about who is to blame as a problem of per capita, then those countries look a lot less bad than they're commonly portrayed to be. Interestingly, some countries that we might usually think of as good environmental citizens, like Canada, for instance, look really bad when we think about it as per capita consumption. And so certainly the United States is worse, so to speak, than China or India in per capita. Canada is actually worse than the United States, so, bad Canada. Another way of thinking about responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions and climate change is also to think about carbon intensity. So countries that produce greenhouse gases, there's a way of measuring how much greenhouse gases they produce and tagging it to their overall GDP or gross domestic product, in essence the size of their economy. And what you can see is that some countries are pretty energy efficient at generating revenue or contributing to the global economy. So you can take a country like the United States, for instance, which is the largest single economy right now. And what you can see is that if you think about the size of its economy and compare it to the amount of greenhouse gases it produces, actually a fairly environmentally efficient economy in comparison to some other countries. So for instance, if you look at this graph right here, which shows emissions intensity of the top 10 emitters, including the United States and Indonesia and Japan, what you can see is that the United States is actually more efficient per unit of GDP than Canada, than China, than Russia, and than Indonesia. Okay, so it's not. The United States looks a lot better when we put it that way, right? So we're contributing a lot to the global economy, but we're doing so, we're doing so in a relatively energy efficient way. And then the fourth way of thinking about greenhouse gas or responsibility is to look at historic responsibility. So greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, but not only, can last in the atmosphere for more than 100 years. And it varies. I think methane lasts, I want to say like 12 to 14 years or something like that. So different greenhouse gases accumulate at different rates, and they have different what you call global warming potentials. And what that means is that a lot of the emissions that we're dealing with right now were emissions that were given off or produced in the 1920s or even before that. And so this was around the time that many countries, including, particularly in Western Europe, were industrializing. And so if you think of the overall contribution to greenhouse gas emissions historically between 1850 and now, what we see is that some countries look really, really bad. So even though China is the biggest current emitter, at a historic percentage, as this next graph shows, this next picture shows, is responsible for only about 11% of total greenhouse gas emissions. In comparison, the EU, all 28 of them are responsible for about a quarter, and the United States for another 27%. And the rest of the world, all other countries combined, outside of the top 10, responsible for only 17%. Okay? So what this means, right, is that the way in which we think about what is driving the problem is going to affect how we think about who is responsible and therefore how much emissions they're quote-unquote supposed to commit to. If we think about it from an aggregate current emissions perspective right now, and there's good reason to do so, then China looks really bad because they're the number one emitter. If you think about it from a per capita perspective, then other countries like Canada look really bad because they're really, they have a very high emission per capita. If you think about it from energy efficiency, the United States doesn't look that bad, and other countries, including Russia and China, look a little bit worse. And if you think about it from historic responsibility, then the EU looks really bad, in large part because of the industrial process of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. So even though now they're good climate citizens in comparison, historically they have a lot to answer for. And these are not just academic points. Throughout the climate negotiation, the history of climate negotiation, between 1988, when the IPCC was formed, and 1992, when the UN Framework on Climate Change was negotiated, and 2004, when the Kyoto Protocol came into force, the G77 countries like India and China and Brazil made various interpolations of these arguments. So they advanced at certain points in time the per capita argument, other points in time the historic responsibility argument, to try to position how we should govern climate change moving forward. So all of these things together have led to very weak international institutional arrangements around the issue, as I'm sure many of you are aware about. And what's made it even more difficult, and what has built in inequity into the system, is that like every other international institution, it's very difficult for non-state actors to get themselves represented. So one of the things I mentioned a short while ago was the fact that climate change has some gender inequity built into it, particularly in areas where the division of labor is very heavily gendered, which is a lot of places. But there are also mechanisms that have been adopted to deal with climate change that have other forms of inequity built into them. So, for example, one of the solutions, so-called solutions to deal with climate change, is the conversion of forests into carbon sinks and selling carbon sinks or afforestation practices or projects as ways for countries to get, or for companies to purchase carbon credits and sell them in the climate market. The problem is that by adopting afforestation as a method of generating carbon credits, that has incentivized governments and corporate actors to promote fast growth forest trees in areas that don't necessarily, that are not necessarily native territory for certain trees, and that might be areas that have historically been held by indigenous people, particularly in developing countries, as ways of attaining credits on the international carbon market. And so what that has meant is that some of the mechanisms we've used to deal with climate change have actually exacerbated inequity by encouraging governments to dispossess rural indigenous people from their lands, particularly in areas where they don't have documented land tenure practices, in order to sell credits on the international market to other people, to other industrial actors. So there's a lot of inequity built into the system, and the structure of incentives, the way that, as with many institutions, we've ended up privileging the voices of governmental leaders and not necessarily people who are affected by climate change, means that negotiations have historically been very difficult and subject to the same kind of politicization of interest as pretty much everything. You know, we saw this issue as well to a different extent when we looked at genocide and Rwanda. So all of this politicization has beset and bedeviled the climate change regime historically. And if you know how the Framework Convention emerged and the problems that have plagued it since its inception, it will make a lot more sense why it's been so hard to get any binding agreement and why the Kyoto Protocol looks the way that it does. So the short version is that when international society began negotiating the climate change regime in the early 1990s, less developed countries at the very outset argued that they should not be held responsible for cutting any emissions. And their general state position was that because climate change and many of the environmental problems that the world was facing was caused by the industrialization of the already modernized world, that those countries should be the ones that should take responsibility and take the lead in cutting emissions. This is a historical argument as well as an overall emissions argument. And China in particular was one of the primary pushers to set the stage that developing countries should not be held accountable for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. US, of course, was opposed to this and has historically made the case that it doesn't make sense for the United States to participate in a regime if China, India, and Brazil were not going to be held accountable. The EU, at the time the European Community, was one of the strongest pushers for climate change and was the actor most responsible for setting 1990 as the baseline date for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And the fact that you had all these actors with very different goals, the EU as being a pusher, less developing countries having their perspective, the US having their perspective, Russia as well having a different perspective because it was coming out of the Cold War, meant that the first agreement, the Framework Convention, was set up in such a way that no country had really binding targets under the UNFCCC. There were targets that were specified, but they were not obligatory to member states. They were just kind of suggestions. And so the first thing that countries tried to do after that was negotiate a binding agreement, and that was the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol was operationalized in 2001, came into force in 2004 after Russia ratified it, and the goal of the Kyoto Protocol was to get member states to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 5.2% below 1990 levels at the end of the compliance period. Now, interestingly, the Kyoto Protocol actually met its goals. Many people think of the Kyoto Protocol as a failure, but it's worth pointing out that the countries that signed on to the Kyoto Protocol, the so-called Annex 1 countries, did in fact meet their stated goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels by 5.2%. But here's the kicker. The way in which they structured the 5.2% goal was that they took the emissions of countries at 1990 and they pegged that as the baseline from which all emissions would be calculated, and then they aggregated them together. Now, unfortunately, because the Soviet Union, or countries that were formerly in the Soviet Union, had just started their collapse, right? The economic collapse after the transition away from socialism. What this meant was that the emissions that they had in 1990 were emissions that were artificially propped up by governmental spending, and as they transitioned to the market economy and their economies collapsed, their overall emissions plummeted almost purely by accident. It had nothing to do with complying with climate change and everything to do with economic catastrophe. Now, because those emissions were factored into the overall calculation, by default the Kyoto Protocol met its goal, but it had nothing to do with actual compliance with climate change. It was purely because the actual responsibilities or the obligations were so poorly designed and so easy for countries to meet that they complied with it almost by default. And that tends to be one of the problems with binding agreements. You can establish binding agreements, but the way in which you usually get countries in a sovereign system to sign on to binding agreements is to make the agreements weak and so easy to comply with that countries can sign on to it without really having to feel that they have to overcommit too much. And that has also been one of the major problems of the climate change regime. So because binding agreements have historically, not just in climate change but in other areas as well, have been so problematic, as the Kyoto Protocol, as it became clear that the Kyoto Protocol was failing, was being very problematic, right? States complied with it by accident. No developing nations were part of the Kyoto Protocol for perhaps understandable reason. One of the issues that had faced the international society as Kyoto was coming to the end of its compliance period in 2012 was what to do next. And so there was a push to create a new binding agreement, something to prop up the Kyoto Protocol. And in fact, the Kyoto Protocol was given an extension until this year. But there was also a push to create a non-binding agreement in addition to a stringent set of requirements. And the reason that was given was that with non-binding agreements, it's a lot easier to get states to be ambitious than with binding agreements. Because the problem with having obligations specified is that states may worry that they will sign up to a binding agreement and fail to meet them, and that might look bad, or that they might be subject to sanction, and as a result they'd be less likely to do so. Now, to be clear and to be fair, it is not always the case that states will sign up to an agreement and then fail to comply with it out of malice. Sometimes governments, particularly in issues like the environment, which has a lot of cognitive complexity, science that may not always be entirely clear, a difficulty in structuring incentives or transitioning your economy. It's complicated stuff. Because of all of those complexities, countries might very well sign up to an agreement and then find themselves unable to actually comply with it. Information about greenhouse gases might change, models might be inaccurate, countries might just not have the technical capacity to promote a transition, an economic transition, in the time frame that they had originally agreed upon. And if you are a country and you're worried about that, you probably don't want to sign up to a binding agreement, fail to meet the targets, and then have everybody blame you for sabotaging it. And so, by pushing for non-binding agreements in addition to the binding agreements in Kyoto. It was hoped by the Obama administration, which was one of the primary pushes for the Paris Agreement, that countries would be able to sign on to something, that would be able to meaningfully commit to something. It was clear that the developing countries, particularly when led by China, were not going to abide by, the Kyoto Protocol, and they haven't. But at the same time, because developing countries like the Alliance of Small Island States, or AOSIS, Small Island Developing States, or SIDS, there was a split between Brazil and India in the BRICS coalition, or Brazil, Russia, India, China. You had the G77 was no longer acting purely as a bloc in negotiations. And since you had this breakdown of consensus among developing countries, where the sub-Saharan African nations were pushing for a stronger agreement, as well as the island nation states, India began supporting some kind of agreement. It became a lot more possible after 2012 to get developing countries to actually try to commit to something. And that's where the Paris Agreement came out. The Paris Agreement is a non-binding agreement, which is important. And so as a result, the way it is structured is that parties to the Paris Agreement do not have internationally negotiated targets that are obligatory in the way that they did in the Kyoto Protocol, or in fact in the Montreal Protocol, which Barnett also recommends. And so if you take a look at this next chart, which you can get online, so you'll see here, and you can see this at the World Resources Institute, see the URL right there. So if you scroll down, what this will show you are what are called the nationally determined contributions by countries to the Paris Agreement. So again, the way it works is that countries pledge, first of all, to do something about climate change. They design their own contributions, what are called nationally determined contributions. They report on them. They agree that they will try to meet them, and they will coordinate things like aid through the Green Climate Fund, in theory, among members to the Paris Agreement. And so the interesting thing about the NDCs is that if you click on any country, what you'll get is a variety of different measures of what countries are supposed to do. So, well, I guess we can ignore the United States for now since they're out. But let's pick China, for instance, right? So if you click on China right there, and it shows you China's NDC, what it says right here, damn cookies, what it says right here is that, so China's goal for climate, for the Paris Agreement, is that they will peak carbon dioxide around 2030, lower carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP, so in other words, become more carbon efficient, and increase forest stock volume by around 4.5 billion meters on the 2005 level, right? So there you have China's statement. They're not really going to cut emissions yet. They're going to continue increasing emissions and a peak around 2030, and then be more efficient after that. If you take another country, so let's take, Spain, okay? So if you take Spain, for instance, and look at, so Spain has is part of the EU, so they have a joint NDC. And so the EU's joint NDC is, do they have it here? Damn it, EU, screwing me up. Alright, let's pick another country. Let's choose, let's do Australia right there. Okay. So Australia, right, so here's their agreement. So under their nationally determined contribution, Australia will implement an economy-wide target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 28% below 2005 levels by 2030, okay? So their target is something that's pegged to a certain year that they will cut by a specific amount, by a specific percentage. So that's a different kind of contribution than the Chinese contribution, which is purely about energy efficiency and peaking its kind, right? Here we have, so this is actually kind of helpful because here it talks about Argentina. So Argentina's standard changed from, so it's going to move to a fixed contribution. And let's see if they have theirs here. Well, this is not the best designed website, but in any case, you can click through this right here and look at the different countries, and by doing so, you can get a sense of how they differ. Some countries are moving towards energy efficiency, some have just kind of general statements about contributions. See Nigeria right here, see what they have. Okay, so Nigeria has, let's say, a baseline scenario target. Where is it? Alright, so yeah, so Nigeria says right here they will make an unconditional contribution of 20% below BAU, improving energy efficiency by a certain amount, and so on and so forth, right? So in any case, the point is that different countries have different kinds of contributions because these are all nationally determined. And some are pegged to what other countries will do, and some are just purely unconditional commitments. So the Paris Agreement's not, it still falls short, to be honest. And I think, if you go to the UNEP website, you can see something called the emissions gap, which indicates that we are still, like 13 gigatons short of where we're supposed to be if we're going to meet the goals that we want to reach. But it is substantially better than the Kyoto Protocol, and it's a marked improvement in many reasons above where we were before, because the commitments are non-binding and because they're nationally determined. And of course, the reason we have that is because attempts to get binding agreements were so politically difficult before. Now, unfortunately, of course, even though Paris was a step forward, we know that it's been beset in recent times by, of course, the Trump administration withdrawing from Paris. Bolsonaro from Brazil threatening to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. It's not entirely clear, if you will. And so the political momentum towards getting all of us on board to doing something, and doing something in a way that was nationally compatible or compatible with national interests, is now being threatened again by this kind of proto-nationalist, isolationist, not really cooperative foreign policy by the Trump administration. We've spoken in the past few lectures about undermining global governance in a variety of areas, and how this is making progress towards any kind of shared goal more difficult. And a large part of the problem is that Trump is still stuck in this idea about the fact that the United States is ostensibly losing to China as a result of the Paris Agreement, in large part based on a complete misrepresentation of what the Paris Agreement is actually about. So if you take a look at this next video, in which President Trump crows about withdrawing from Paris, and keep in mind the fact that the obligations under the Paris Agreement are all nationally determined, not binding, and therefore not structured in the same way as Kyoto, you'll see that his representation of what actually happens is completely off base.
Thus, as of today, the United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord and the draconian financial and economic burdens the agreement imposes on our country.
And with that, Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the most comprehensive climate deal in the history of the planet, and the best hope of limiting continued global warming. Trump spent most of the 28-minute Rose Garden speech talking about economics.
The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries, leaving American workers, who I love, and taxpayers to absorb the cost.
But when he did talk about the Paris Agreement, he was almost entirely wrong.
Even if the Paris Agreement were implemented in full, with total compliance from all nations, it is estimated it would only produce a 0.2 of 1 degree. Think of that. This much.
Actually, the Paris Climate Agreement wasn't going to reduce global temperatures at all. The goal was always to cap the rise in global warming at 2 degrees Celsius. And even that goal meant coming to terms with a future in which tidal areas disappear, climate refugees are a daily part of life, and food and water scarcity could lead to greater violence between people and countries. Paris was hardly optimistic.
India will be allowed to double its coal production by 2020. Think of it. India can double their coal production. We're supposed to get rid of ours.
Actually, India has canceled plans to build nearly 14 gigawatts of coal-fired power stations. Claims of China getting a better deal are just as baseless. But that's not even the point. Part of the reason 194 other parties signed on to the Paris Agreement is that it doesn't actually require any of them to do anything specific. They each got to pick their own path to reaching their commitments. So, if the United States wanted to, for example, double coal output and quadruple solar, it could do that. It would break the pledge, but there are no consequences for breaking it. The entire agreement is a giant global pinky promise in which everybody tries to do the right thing for the planet.
As the Wall Street Journal wrote this morning, the reality is that withdrawing is in America's economic interest and won't matter much to the climate.
The numbers are pretty simple. If the US doesn't drastically reduce its current carbon output, it'll be responsible for an additional 0.3 degrees Celsius of global warming by 2100. And it's not like other countries could simply pull more weight. According to a study in Nature Climate Change, any delay from the United States makes the overall target of limiting warming to 2 degrees unreachable. You can say it was a job speech. You can say it was a brilliant tactical speech that will allow Trump to renegotiate for terms that benefit Americans. And some Trump supporters will say that. What you can't say is that Trump's speech was fluent in the facts of the very agreement he's pulling out of.
So it's a little bit grim. There is some good news, I suppose. So one of which is that the kind of political bloc that maybe and that Barnett were talking about, the separation between the industrialized nations and the G77 plus China that had made everything up to Kyoto so difficult, that has faded away big time, in large part because of Africa's desire to get something done on climate change, as well as other countries, including, well, I guess Brazil before Bolsonaro, and India for a while as well, right? So those countries have been more willing to put developing nations on the line to do something about climate change. Before Trump, we had Obama, who was willing to do something about climate change. And so at the very least, the strong bloc or the complete gridlock that we've seen before has shown itself to be amenable to negotiation, or at least it's shown itself to be impermanent. Now China, for whatever reason, might become the new leader in climate, which could be alarming, but could also be encouraging, because one of the biggest issues facing China is, in fact, environmental hazards and environmental catastrophes. And in fact, environmental protests have been one of the major sources of domestic instability in China. So, it's not as if China is immune to the problem of environmental hazards. And so there's reasons to believe that for, its own self-preservation, that the Chinese government might, regardless of whether or not it transitions to a liberal system, they might actually want to do something about climate change and about pollution in general. And so there's hope to believe, or there's reason to believe, that even without Trump's leadership for the next, the next few months to maybe 4 years, that all may not necessarily be lost for climate change, or at least for the momentum for climate change. So this is crucial because it suggests that things may be difficult, but not impossibly so. And I guess the takeaway from all of that is that, first, climate change, of course, is a major threat to security, however you want to measure it. And historically, second, the difference in vulnerability and responsibility has made it very difficult to get any momentum on addressing climate change. But the shift to a non-binding approach in Paris and the opening up of space for more ambition has meant that there's been more incentive and political momentum now than before. And I suppose the question becomes, what will the next few years hold for what we do about climate? Because this is certainly, this might be the last opportunity we have to do something about it. So, maybe a little bit of optimism there, I don't know, but that's going to be it for today. Thanks, guys, and yeah, hope your summer goes well. All right, take it easy.